Initially, when I planned this session, I had thought about organizing it and structuring it as a formal book launch. You know, the format where you have some important personages up on stage with you and they say nice things about you and your writing, and then you untie the book and you open the paper and you reveal it to the world, you know. It's kind of a significant, magical moment. Of course, the thing is that excitement of that is slightly dissipated by the fact that you're living in multiple cities, so you've already launched the book somewhere else potentially, plus you're online. So it kind of, that was a difficulty I faced. The other was, you know, who important personage should I ask? And of course, we have a lot of wonderful homegrown literary figures of great import. I mean, Nama Bengaluru's Ram Guha and Girish Karnad, and, you know, but the list is long. But why would a historian like Ram Guha really be interested in literary short fiction? Mr. Karnad has done me the honor of reading one of my stories, but, you know, I couldn't really ask him. And, well, and you know, you just keep thinking about other possibilities. I thought about asking the president of the International Music and Arts Society, but that seemed a little bit nepotistic since that's my mother and the book is dedicated to her. And I thought about asking the secretary of the society. After all, the society's stood steadfast for so many years. But she's a good friend. And my niece, you know, she's a wonderful writer, Samita Arni, but that thread of nepotism still, anyway, I'm just meandering on with excuses. The point of the matter is that I was a little bit preoccupied with other priorities, and to be honest, I did not put together a proper set of important personages for the stage. And in effect, all you have is me talking about putting this collection together. Curating this collection of 19 stories was not easy. I've been writing for many years, and ever since I moved back to India, and I have stories, you know, that started in 2005 almost, and that I've been writing. You would think that because I'm an editor and I curate these collections every quarter of short stories, you would think that it would be a fairly easy task for me to put them all together. Because despite what you might think, you know, Out of Print, which is the magazine I run where I put together these stories every quarter, has a certain coherence. Every collection has a certain coherence. It's likely that the reader doesn't see it, but we get a mass of stories, and through them we sort of filter through, and usually there's a resonance between the stories in theme, or perhaps in quality of writing, in time span, in the nature of the story somehow, and the issue that it's addressing. So there is a coherence. And so I thought that it would be easy enough for me to put together a collection. In fact, I thought it would be a breeze. But in fact, I struggled a great deal. At first, I thought I would just put all the stories in, but that ended up being fairly choppy. And then I thought to myself, why don't I refine it? And I started to just get too categorical. My first thought was to try and put together sort of dark fiction or speculative fiction or strange fiction stories that I've written. Now, I trained as a scientist, and I'm accustomed to working in fact. Part of my family is staunchly scientific. We are structured, and we know how to frame things. And of course, I mean, I'm grown up in India, and nothing is really framed by one set alone. You have all these multiple influences all the time. But you know, despite the fact that I ended up having this scientific background and I'm used to thinking structurally, I found that a lot of my stories were pushing against that frame of reality and really moving into the speculative fiction or strange fiction slipstream space. And many of them really ended up being almost kind of veering towards fantasy. And at first I thought it was because I was just being a little lazy about bringing resolution to my story. I didn't know what to do, so let's just create a fantasy world sort of thing. But it's not that. It's as if the stories really were pushing against something, and that they were trying to extend into another dimension. So I thought maybe I'll put those stories together. The other theme that I ended up sort of thinking about putting together were a lot of stories on maternity and fertility and reproduction and that sort of thing. And who would have thought I would write those stories? You know, it really wasn't, of course, I mean, I've thought about it. Everybody does. A woman does it sometime in her life, and everyone does. It's sort of a natural process of life. But I think that the reason why it became of such import to me, I sort of examine it now, and I believe, is because I worked in biology and I worked with biological molecules. And although I wasn't doing any experiments, I was doing simulation. Every biological molecule, every little aggregate of biological molecules, even that most, I mean, and of course, that most sophisticated aggregate of biological molecules, which is the cell, that little capsule of life, is trying to replicate itself, you know, is trying to create a copy of itself. And I think that embedded my interest in this idea of trying to create another form, and so it gave rise to this whole range of stories that I ended up writing, which were sort of in that category or theme, one could say. But in the end, and this is where, you know, you miss not having an important personage next to you to say this for you. But in the end, I think I filtered the stories based on quality. You know, in the end, you sort of think, my editorial eye, I think, was the one that sort of looked at all my stories and said, well, some of these really don't have any maturity in expression. And so it was that filter that ended up making me choose which stories went into the collection. So the collection has a whole range of different themes and sorts of things that I talk about. The first story in it was written, I think the earliest story in it, rather, was written in 2008, just after the attack on the Taj in Mumbai. And the most recent one is from 2017, actually, and was written. It had been in my head because it was a lot of family stories that were in there, but it was written in response really to an extremely evocative trip. I talked about it in an earlier session today as well, an extremely evocative family trip that we had to Tanjavur, to where my family's roots from all different sides come from. And so that sort of really got the story going, and it began to take shape. And it's about a young widow who's fairly independent and autonomous to an extent. So this is the collection of stories that I have, and what I thought I would do would be to read from one of them, if you would like, and if not, not. I'll talk about them some more. But before I get into reading, I do want to make one really important, staunch point, which is that these are all fictional stories. These are fictional stories that are entirely just created from imagination. Of course, you have influence from family stories, of which there are always many. You are influenced by conversations that you listen to tales that somebody else tells you, stories from an entirely different source. You're influenced by what you read, what you see, what you sort of come across. I live part of the time in Bombay, and you're stuck in a traffic jam, and there's a whole microcosm of things going on, and that tends to impact you. And so these are entirely fictional sort of creations. And the reason I'm staunchly insisting upon it is so that there's family honor at stake here. So that if you read a story about a character's lesbian grandmother, it's got nothing to do with my family. I insist on that. No, I'm kidding. I mean, of course, if we did have a story about a lesbian grandmother, I'd be proud and happy to try and do honor to her by writing a story about her. So I am going to read a story for you. At first, I had thought about reading one that was called, that's actually given the session the title, which is Taboo, Desire, and a Dead Woman's Saris. But I think instead I might read one which is called Rockfall. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to extricate my glass, or rather my cousin's glasses now. Sorry, this afternoon my glasses just snapped in two. So I tried increasing the font size to some enormous thing, but I'm very grateful to have a pair of glasses to read from. Okay, here we are. I'm going to read off my computer because of the whole script thing, but and I'm also accustomed to doing that. The story is called Rockfall. I actually did publish it before putting it into this collection in the other anthology that I co-edited along with another writer. And we had, in that anthology, we both put in our stories as well. And this one was published there. Rockfall. It's a very steep climb, madam, Joseph Raju told Marcia as they prepared to set out. We must be careful. Rocks are slippery. She didn't seem to hear him. She was busy writing in a small black-bound notebook. Her rough, dry hair blew across her face. Joseph, standing discreetly to the side, was looking down at the ground, but he saw the shadow of her hand as she tucked the errant strands carelessly behind her ear. The sight catapulted him into the past. The first time he had touched his Jiva's hair, it had been to tuck it behind her ear. They were in the church quadrangle, and a sudden gust of wind whipped Jiva's white dupatta about like a mainsail in the crosswind. Her cotton kurta clung to her body. Joseph had stood still, captivated. Then the dupatta set sail like the boats in his native town departing for the open seas. Jiva giggled, and Joseph ran after the piece of cotton. By the time he brought it back, her hair was like a cyclone around her head, a heavy black silk cyclone, alive and seductive. Unable to resist, Joseph caught a strand of that piece of her and tucked it behind her ear. All this time later, he could still feel its weight on his fingers, a thick, silken, fluid weight. Jiva had giggled once more and stepped back, her eyes brilliant with excitement at his boldness. Come, come, Joseph, we must forge on. Got to get to the cave and down before dark, Marcia declared. I'm going to skip a bit now and then go on further. They walked for 2 hours along the dry riverbed towards the dam. Washed by river water for an eternity, the rocks shone dark and intense as if layer upon layer below the surface through the sun's brilliance back. It was hot and hypnotic. Joseph, who had been here many times, was always impressed by the beauty of the granite, shining like Jiva's hair, like her eyes. The day Jiva arrived among the rocks as Joseph's bride, it was 45 degrees Celsius. This is it, your famous place, she said, looking around as they stepped down into the dusty bus stand. He nodded and started to point out various features when she interrupted to say, I'm so thirsty, get me a gold spot, Joseph. They only had mangola at the shop, warm mangola. Squeezed into the rickshaw on the way to the room he rented on the main street, Joseph tried to put his arm around Jiva, but she shrugged him away. Skipping again and moving on, one day she asked, Where is the movie theatre? The new Rajnikant film must be out. The theatre was in the district centre, a bus ride away. They were late, despite which Jiva was happy, chattering excitedly through the film. By the end, Joseph was exhausted by the imagery and the noise and the coarseness of it. His ardor felt like the river that dammed upstream had transformed from a wild, gushing flow to a sludgy, polluted trickle. Soon Joseph stopped going to the cinema, letting Jiva go off with the busload that departed when the new movie came out. He renewed his passion for the rocks, taking intrepid tourists to remote meditation caves far above the riverbeds, accessible only when the waters were low. They walk on, and they've climbed up. Sorry, I'm distracted by the other session, but I'm going to concentrate. Marcia liked to talk to him as they walked about her travels and her life, and she listened to him as well. When her face lit up with interest, he forgot he didn't like her thick body and pale hair. He felt tempted to touch her strong, muscled shape. He told her about the extraordinary hidden carvings of the goddess. "Take me to see it, Joseph," Marcia said after they'd walked for about 2 hours. He had tried to take Jiva there once. It had been difficult to persuade her to come. It had been difficult to keep going. "I'm slipping. I'm slipping. Why do you bring me here?" she complained as he helped her. A few steps later, she said, "Oh, it's so hot. I can't go any further." "Come, Jiva, it's beautiful." "Enough beauty, Joseph. It's enough. I don't want to see another stupid rock." Suddenly she shrieked, "Look, look," and pointed with her finger. "What happened, Jiva? Can't you see? That's the place, the exact spot they shot Rajnikant in his last hit." She indicated the flat rock on the other side, the exact spot, song sequence. She hummed a filmy tune, "I Have to Tell Somnath." Somnath was Jiva's latest beau. He had a motorbike. She didn't have to weather the crowds on the bus anymore, and the movie events seemed to happen with greater and greater frequency. Often, when Joseph returned home, Somnath was just departing, a pleased smile on his face. Joseph tried not to care. Marcia was telling Joseph about her recent breakup. "He never saw the beauty I saw in nature," she said of her partner. Yes, yes, I'm understanding. Always the exact same problem with Jiva. Once I was so mad, I felt like pushing him off a cliff. I have the same feeling, madam. In my case, not cliff, but rocks. I'm pushing off the rocks. This is the place." "What am I looking for, Joseph? I don't see anything. No carvings." No carvings. Jiva's resting place. There is the Rajnikant song sequence rock." "You mean?" Here, I pushed her off. The rock's here." Marcia scrambled backwards awkwardly. Joseph thought she was trying to imitate Jiva. He laughed politely, although he didn't think it was funny. It was no joking matter. This was a sacred spot, the spot where he had consecrated his emotion to the eternal, burning stillness of the rocks. He regretted showing Marcia this place. He regretted telling her about Jiva. He thought Marcia understood, but now her eyes were not shining, but afraid, staring at him as though he were a strange, ugly animal. He felt a surge of anger as he stepped towards her and thrust his arms forward with a snarl. Marcia staggered and fell. After a moment of silence, Joseph's sense of correctness, of formality, reasserted itself. He advised Marcia to be careful, just as he had advised Jiva. Jiva had answered, alternately begging and screeching. Her voice echoed and distorted. He had covered his ears and left. Marcia didn't respond at all. If she was going to play games, he would leave her. "I'm returning to the town now, madam." He bent down and called into the crevice. His voice echoed back faintly, "Madam, madam, man." Sorry, I need this. I was moved to read the story partly by all of our responses recently to the huge discussion on harassment and the vulnerability we are all facing, but also because, well, I liked writing it. I think I'll stop now. I have other stories, but I'll stop and open to questions, and then I can come back to reading some more if we have the time. And if nobody has any questions, I'll just continue reading or talking. Anyone has anything to say? Can I read more? Okay, certainly I will in a minute. So one of the things about writing short fiction is that you are trying to create a really small and intense world in a very short time. And a lot of people say to me, so the short fiction is preparation for a novel. But indeed, that's not really so, because I think with short fiction, what you do is you put a lot of intensity into a single world. And you are creating sort of a condensed novel in many ways, although that's not how the purists would actually think of the form. And so I've never really been driven to write the long form. I've always been interested in writing short fiction. And I think there are a number of writers who do that. Alice Munro, for example, who did win the Nobel Prize for doing it, and various others. But the thing about writing in the short form is that you have to be extremely attentive to not having an excess of information. You know, you have other characters. So some of the bits that I skipped and didn't read, you do have other characters that enter into the story. And you even have, for example, Somnath. But you just have to reference what he's been up to, as it were. You don't need to tell his story. Whereas in a novel, you might create the whole Somnath character and talk about him and why he's pursuing Jiva and not all the other foreign ladies who are there in the tourist site and so on and so forth. So that's kind of one of the points. Yes, I see a question down there. Hi, Devalina. If you could take it down there.
Hi, Indira.
Hello.
It's so nice to see you here, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
So, if I'm not wrong, this is the second time you've been associated with a short stories collection.
Yeah, well, yes and no. Well, first of all, I have to acknowledge Debalina because she and I both share a kind of a writing mentor, Rebecca Lloyd, who, in fact, wrote one of the blurbs for the book. And so both of us are kind of partners in crime, as it were, in writing. This is the second. This is the second collection, the anthology, which was a collection of stories by different people. Rebecca and I co-edited, and this is my collection independently of my stories alone. So yeah,
Wonderful. So, I had been reading the story, The Rockfall, which you just illustrated right now.
Yeah.
If I'm not wrong, it was there in Pangea as well.
Yes, it was published in Pangea, as I
So my
said.
question is, when you say you've shortlisted your stories which are going to go in your anthology,
Yes.
how would you, how would be the sequencing of your stories? Why do I find Rockfall here towards the end in this book and not so in Pangea? That would be my question.
Okay. Yes, it is actually a very interesting question how you juxtapose the stories in a collection. And when I put this collection together, I first, I had put as I told you, I thought about different collections. But when this particular collection came to shape, a couple of different people were instrumental in helping me put it together. And one of them was Priya Sarukai Chabria, and the poet, and the other, of course, was Ajita GS, whom I have to thank and acknowledge as also Kartika for taking the collection. But Priya said to me, one of the difficulties with putting together a short story collection is, do they read well together, one after the other? And she said, why don't, next time I'm in Bombay, where I sort of lived part of the time, we can sit down together and go through it, and I'll say, no, this doesn't come well, we'll juggle them around. In the end, I did not use her input, but in fact, I did need to think a great deal about which story goes after which. Rockfall came at the end because I felt that after Rebecca and I had worked together with it and edited it, it had a certain soundness. And also, it's a more real story, not one of the hyper-real or I don't know, what would you call it, fantasy stories. So I was thinking that it would be nice to end with a story that takes us back to the rocks, as it were. Yes.
Hi, Indira.
Hi.
I've sadly to say I've never heard of you before because I'm not much of a book reader.
Oh my gosh, I have to leave now.
But my first interaction with you and hearing, I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but I think you sound like Rachel Weisz, which really, I really love.
Or rather, Rachel Weisz sounds like me.
That would be correct. So I really enjoyed your narration, and mostly I like dark fiction a lot, something that chills me because over the years I've just become very bored with books and more towards life discussions. So this was very, I think that's why I've enjoyed these 2 days so much, because I get to see the people who are putting it down in form.
Yes.
So I was thinking when I was hearing your stuff, all I could think was, this is deliciously fluid. This is the way I like it. It's honest. I could see it in your face. I can see you. So it made it all the more better.
Thank you for that. But it's actually an interesting thing because earlier today, I was having a discussion with somebody about whether you need to know a writer, you know, and sometimes you read something and it's terribly moving, and then you get to either meet the person or read their biography and find out that they were really a horrible person, treated women badly, etc., etc. And you think, oh, I wish I'd never known all that about them, because in their fictional form they were able to create something that spoke to you personally. So I'm glad I haven't disappointed you thus far. Thank you.